If you've ever felt like no matter how hard you work, real wealth always seems out of reach, then here's an uncomfortable truth. Making money is only half the battle. Keeping it is far harder. History is full of families who built unimaginable fortunes, only to watch them disappear within a generation or two. What destroyed them wasn't bad luck or one terrible decision. It was a combination of things that may appear subtle on the surface, but are powerful enough to undo decades of success. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden mistakes that brought down some of the most powerful dynasties in history, and the silent patterns that continue to destroy wealth today. Stick around until the end, because the last hidden mistake is by far the most important. Let's get started. Number 1. Confusing market control with moral authority. To understand how even the mightiest fortunes can unravel, you have to look at the Medici family of Renaissance Florence. On paper, they were bankers. In reality, they were something much larger. Their financial empire was so powerful that it shaped politics, culture, and even religion. And they didn't just manage money, they effectively managed a city, influencing who rose to power, which artists were celebrated, and how entire institutions functioned. For decades, it seemed as though nothing in Florence happened without Medici approval. Over time, however, that influence turned into something more dangerous. The family began to believe that financial success gave them a kind of moral and political entitlement. Market dominance slowly morphed into cultural superiority. In their minds, controlling money meant they deserved to control ideas, laws, and public life as well. But wealth can buy influence. It cannot buy permanent legitimacy. As the Medici blurred the line between economic power and moral authority, public trust began to erode. Once that trust disappeared, their fortune could no longer protect them. What had once looked like leadership started to feel like arrogance, and resentment grew. The lesson is simple and timeless. Markets forgive mistakes, but societies rarely forgive entitlement. The same pattern appears today when large corporations assume that financial success makes them culturally untouchable. Backlash may be slow, but history shows it almost always arrives. Number 2. Treating scale as stability. If any family seemed truly immune to failure, it was the Rothschilds in the 19th century. Their wealth stretched across Europe like a vast financial web. They financed governments, funded railways, and connected entire economies through bonds and trade networks. By almost every visible measure, they had built something unstoppable. Their operations were enormous, complex, and deeply embedded in the infrastructure of the modern world. To most observers, a system that large had to be permanent. But their strength depended on a specific kind of world, one built on open borders, expanding trade, and relatively stable geopolitics. When those conditions changed, their model began to struggle. Nationalism rose, wars disrupted commerce, and governments became less willing to rely on international banking dynasties. The Rothschild system had been designed for efficiency and reach, not for radical shifts in the global order. That was the hidden danger of their success. The larger and more interconnected their operations became, the harder it was to adapt. Massive systems move slowly, and slow systems suffer when the rules change. The same illusion exists today in global corporations and supply chains that confuse size with security. Scale can delay problems, but it doesn't prevent them. In fact, it often makes real change far more difficult when it finally becomes unavoidable. Number 3. Financial engineering without product reality. Few names in American history are as closely tied to raw industrial power as the Vanderbilts. In the Gilded Age, they built one of the largest fortunes the world had ever seen by mastering the systems that controlled transportation and trade. They consolidated railroads, structured complex financial deals, and used their dominance to set prices in ways that competitors simply couldn't challenge. On paper, it looked like pure business genius, a perfectly engineered machine designed to print money forever. But beneath that impressive structure was a dangerous weakness. The Vanderbilts became experts at extracting value rather than creating it. Their empire was built on leverage, consolidation, and financial maneuvering, not on continuous innovation. As long as the economic environment stayed predictable, this approach worked beautifully. But the moment industries began to evolve and new technologies emerged, they had very little left to fall back on. Instead of reinvesting heavily into new ideas, new industries, and the people who could drive them forward, they focused on squeezing more profit out of what already existed. That strategy can make a fortune grow quickly, but it rarely makes a fortune last. Over time, the Vanderbilt wealth didn't regenerate itself. It simply transferred from one generation to the next, slowly thinning out with each handoff. Without a foundation of innovation or long-term development, the empire gradually lost relevance. Within just a few generations, one of the most powerful families in America had become little more than a historical footnote. The same pattern is visible today in companies that prioritize financial engineering over real progress. These are the ones obsessing over stock buybacks and short-term metrics, while neglecting the actual products and people that created their success in the first place. Number 4, treating identity as an asset instead of a liability. Kodak is often remembered as a classic business failure, but it's more accurate to think of it as a fallen dynasty. For decades, the company didn't just participate in the photography industry, it defined it. The Eastman family name was practically synonymous with film itself. Kodak dominated cameras, film processing, and photographic culture around the world. They were so successful that it was hard to imagine a future where they weren't at the center of the entire industry. And yet, Kodak also provides one of the clearest examples of how success can quietly trap a company in its own identity. The cruel irony is that Kodak actually invented the first digital camera. The future arrived inside their own research labs. But instead of embracing it, the company hesitated. Digital photography threatened the film business that had made them rich, so rather than reinvent themselves, they chose to protect what already existed. Over time, their self-image as a film company became more important than their role as an innovator. That attachment turned fatal. Internal voices pushing for change were ignored, investments flowed toward preserving the past instead of building the future. By the time Kodak finally tried to adapt, the market had already moved on without them. Their collapse wasn't caused by a sudden technological shift or an aggressive competitor. It was caused by a refusal to let go of who they believed they were. The deeper lesson is simple but brutal. When identity becomes sacred, adaptation becomes impossible. And in business, anything that can't adapt eventually disappears. Number 5, inheriting capital without inheriting capability. The Vanderbilt story appears again, but this time from a different angle. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the original architect of the family fortune, built his empire through relentless discipline and hard-nosed operational thinking. He understood logistics, efficiency, and competition at an almost instinctive level. His success wasn't based on luck or prestige. It was based on a mindset shaped by decades of tough practical experience. The problem was that mindset couldn't be passed down as easily as money. When the next generations inherited the Vanderbilt wealth, they received enormous financial resources, but they didn't receive the skills and habits that had created those resources in the first place. There was no structured system to teach them how to manage businesses, no expectation that they would spend years learning the details of the industries they now owned. Instead, wealth became something to be managed socially rather than built strategically. Over time, that disconnect proved disastrous. Capital was divided among heirs who lacked the experience to grow it. Decisions were guided more by status and lifestyle than by long-term planning. What had once been a tightly run industrial empire slowly fragmented into a collection of estates, charities, and personal indulgences. Within 3 generations, the dominance Cornelius Vanderbilt had fought so hard to create was effectively gone. The underlying truth is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Money can be inherited overnight, but capability cannot. And without capability, even the greatest fortune begins to decay the moment it changes hands. Number 6, preserving prestige while surrendering infrastructure. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was filled with powerful merchant banking families whose names carried enormous weight. Institutions like Barings Bank, Hottinger, and the great Dutch trading dynasties had spent generations building reputations that opened every important door. They dined with royalty, advised governments, and moved comfortably through the highest social circles. To the outside world, they appeared untouchable, symbols of old money stability and sophistication. But behind the polished image, a quiet shift was taking place. These families gradually moved away from the gritty, practical foundations that had made them powerful in the first place. They held tightly to their social standing and political connections, but they slowly let go of the physical systems that created real leverage. Shipping fleets were sold off, trade routes were abandoned, and direct control over commodities slipped into the hands of newer, more aggressive competitors. What remained was influence without ownership, reputation without the machinery that had once backed it up. In the end, that proved to be a fragile position. Prestige can impress people, but it cannot move goods, control supply chains, or generate independent power. When economic conditions shifted, these dynasties discovered that admiration from high society was a poor substitute for hard infrastructure. Their names were still respected, but respect alone couldn't protect them from irrelevance. The deeper lesson is that true strength in business is rooted in what you control, not in how you are perceived. Prestige without infrastructure may look impressive, but it offers very little protection when the world begins to change. Number 7. Treating legal structures as permanent shields. Centuries before modern corporations learned to navigate governments and regulations, the Fugger family of Europe believed they had found the perfect formula for unbreakable wealth. They financed emperors, funded military campaigns, and essentially acted as the bankers to entire kingdoms. Their contracts were backed by the highest authorities of the time, and their political connections were unrivaled. From their perspective, the law itself was on their side, permanently securing their fortune. That confidence turned out to be dangerously misplaced. The Fuggers assumed that political favor automatically translated into legal safety, and for a long time it did. But laws are only as strong as the powers that enforce them. When regimes changed, alliances shifted, and new rulers took control, the agreements that once seemed ironclad suddenly became optional. Debts were ignored, contracts were rewritten, and privileges were revoked. What had looked like solid legal protection dissolved almost overnight. The family learned the hard way that legal frameworks are never truly permanent. They exist only as long as the political environment supporting them remains intact. The same pattern appears constantly in the modern world. Corporations build entire business models around favorable regulations, tax loopholes, or government relationships, assuming those advantages will last forever. But when public opinion shifts or political winds change, those protections can vanish with remarkable speed. Wealth that depends too heavily on legal structures rather than genuine economic fundamentals is always more fragile than it appears. 8. Confusing liquidity with strength. Before the Second World War, Japan's great industrial conglomerates, known as the zaibatsu, seemed to possess every advantage a dynasty could want. They controlled vast networks of banks, factories, shipping companies, and trading firms. Many of them sat on enormous piles of cash, large enough to survive almost any downturn. To observers at the time, their financial position looked rock solid. With so much liquidity and so many assets, failure appeared almost impossible. But liquidity can create a dangerous illusion. Having large reserves of cash doesn't automatically mean a system is healthy. In the case of the zaibatsu, their wealth gave them comfort rather than urgency. Instead of using their resources to restructure and adapt to a rapidly changing global economy, many of these conglomerates allowed capital to sit idle. The money was there, but it wasn't being used to rethink outdated strategies or prepare for new realities. Their financial cushion masked deeper strategic problems that continued to grow beneath the surface. When real disruption finally arrived, those cash reserves only delayed the inevitable. Liquidity bought them time, but it didn't buy them a future. The same mistake happens constantly today. Companies with overflowing bank accounts convince themselves they are safe simply because they can survive another quarter or another year. They build so-called war chests that never get meaningfully deployed, mistaking the ability to endure for the ability to evolve. The uncomfortable truth is that cash can postpone difficult decisions, but it can't replace them. Strength comes from adaptation, not from the size of your bank balance. Number 9. Allowing advisors to replace internal judgment. The great European royal dynasties, especially the Habsburgs, provide one of the clearest historical examples of how power can slowly slip away without anyone realizing it. At the height of their influence, the Habsburg family ruled vast territories across Europe and controlled some of the most important political systems in the world. But as their empire grew more complex, the people at the very top became increasingly distant from the day-to-day realities of how that empire actually functioned. Over time, real decision-making shifted away from the rulers themselves and into the hands of court advisors, professional bureaucrats, and layers of political intermediaries. On the surface, this looked efficient and sophisticated. After all, why wouldn't powerful leaders surround themselves with experts? But gradually, something dangerous happened. The Habsburgs stopped directly understanding the systems they were supposed to be governing. Strategy became filtered through committees. Critical choices were shaped by people who were managing the machine rather than truly leading it. That shift created a subtle but fatal weakness. When the people at the top no longer grasp how their own organization works, They lose the ability to act decisively. Instead of clear direction, there is endless consultation. Instead of bold moves, there is cautious consensus, and eventually paralysis sets in. The same pattern shows up constantly in the modern business world. Founders who once knew every detail of their company are replaced by detached boards and layers of management. Decisions get outsourced to consultants and committees, and little by little, internal judgment is replaced by second-hand opinions. History suggests that when leadership stops thinking for itself, decline is rarely far behind. Number 10. Building wealth faster than culture can absorb it. In the 20th century, the discovery of massive oil reserves created fortunes almost overnight. Families who had been ordinary landowners suddenly found themselves in control of staggering amounts of money. These new oil dynasties didn't have to spend generations slowly building wealth. It arrived all at once, faster than anyone could realistically prepare for. And that speed, as it turned out, became one of their greatest vulnerabilities. Money can grow far more quickly than the culture around it. Sudden wealth often brings entitlement, internal conflict, and a distorted sense of reality. In many of these families, enormous fortunes appeared before any real system of values, discipline, or governance had time to develop. Without a shared operating philosophy, different branches of the family pulled in different directions. Disagreements turned bitter, priorities became confused. What should have been a unifying resource instead became a source of division and instability. The deeper problem was that capital arrived before competence. Instead of being used strategically, money became something to fight over, display, or waste. The wealth itself wasn't the issue. The issue was that the human and organizational structures necessary to manage that wealth responsibly simply hadn't had time to mature. You can see the same dynamic today with overnight tech fortunes and cryptocurrency millionaires. When riches appear before wisdom and structure, they often end up doing more harm than good. Culture always lags behind capital, and ignoring that fact has destroyed more fortunes than almost anyone realizes. Number 11. Letting philanthropy replace strategy. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller built two of the most formidable business empires the world had ever seen. They were ruthless, strategic, and intensely focused on controlling the systems that generated their wealth. But in the later stages of their lives, both men gradually shifted their attention away from business and toward philanthropy. Foundations were created, universities were funded, libraries were built, and enormous sums of money were given away in the name of legacy. On the surface, this looked admirable, even noble, but there was an unintended consequence. As more energy went into charitable projects and social influence, less went into renewing and protecting the core engines of their fortunes. The focus moved away from innovation, competition, and long-term economic strategy, and toward preserving a public image as benefactors of society. Moral capital slowly began to replace economic leverage as the central priority. Philanthropy can do extraordinary good, but it cannot substitute for relevance. Charitable giving does not automatically keep a business empire strong. Over time, the structures that had made these dynasties powerful were allowed to fade, while their public legacies grew larger than their private influence. A similar pattern can be seen today when corporations lean heavily on social initiatives and public relations, while avoiding the difficult work of reinvention. Good deeds may improve reputations, but they rarely protect companies from disruption. History makes it clear that generosity, however well-intentioned, is not a strategy for survival. Number 12. Assuming the rules that built the fortune will protect it. If you study the rise and fall of almost any wealthy dynasty, you eventually notice the same final mistake repeating itself. At some point, success becomes so familiar that it stops being questioned. The methods that created the fortune start to feel permanent, almost like laws of nature. Leaders begin to assume that the strategies that worked in the past will continue to work indefinitely. And that assumption, more than anything else, is what quietly brings empires down. Wealth rarely disappears because people take bold risks. In fact, risk is usually what creates fortunes in the first place. What destroys them is rigidity, the slow refusal to adapt when circumstances change. Markets don't punish success. They punish stagnation. They punish companies and families who become so comfortable with their own systems that they stop noticing when those systems no longer fit the world around them. History follows a remarkably consistent pattern. A fortune reaches its peak, and the systems that built it become routine and unquestioned. Adaptation slows, then stops entirely. From the inside, everything still feels stable and secure. From the outside, however, the foundation is already cracking. Decline doesn't announce itself with alarms and warnings. It arrives quietly, disguised as normal business, until the damage is too deep to reverse. Here's the uncomfortable truth about old money. Unlike what most people would want you to believe, great fortunes are not usually destroyed by only laziness, ignorance, or simple bad luck. As we've seen here, most dynasties can fail while being run by intelligent, hardworking people who believe they are doing everything correctly. What brings them down is something many don't notice right away. It's certainty. It's becoming trapped by an identity that once brought success. Yet, families and companies that actually survive for generations understand a different principle. They don't treat wealth as something to be frozen in place. They treat it as something that must be constantly renewed. They question their own assumptions, even when those assumptions had made them rich. They accept that no strategy works forever, and no position is ever truly safe. True old money doesn't preserve wealth. It preserves adaptability. And this, more than any fortune or inheritance, is what separates the dynasties that endure from the ones that disappear. If you want to understand more of the hidden rules that shape wealth, power, and long-term success, subscribe to the channel, because the lessons history leaves behind are far too valuable to ignore.